the upscale neighborhood of Oakwood Heights, a middle-aged black couple stood outside the bistro, keys in hand, ready to begin their new chapter as restaurateurs. What started as a quiet return before opening hours spiraled when longtime hostess Karen Whitfield inserted herself between them and the door, demanding to know why strangers were trying to break in. Marcus Johnson wasn't your typical chef owner. For over 2 decades, he'd clawed his way up the ranks of fine dining, from dishwasher to executive chef, known for outshining his superiors and crafting menus that earned awards they claimed credit for. When Karen called the police, began live streaming accusations and declared she was protecting the neighborhood's legacy, she had no idea she was confronting not only the restaurant's legal owners, but 2 professionals who had faced down systemic bias their entire careers. Marcus stayed calm, producing deeds and licenses, while Amara, a sharp former corporate attorney, handled the rising crowd and pressed record herself, setting off a storm neither Karen nor the community saw coming. What began as a petty power trip became a public unraveling. Oakwood Heights would never forget the day Karen Whitfield tried to block the rightful owners from entering the bistro, only to discover the locks had already changed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Johnson stood back, squinting at the freshly mounted sign above the restaurant's entrance. The elegant script declaring the bistro gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, the gold leaf catching the light exactly as he'd hoped. Beneath it, in smaller lettering, S 1993, renewed 2025. What do you think? He asked, not taking his eyes off the sign. Too pretentious to keep the original establishment date? Amara stepped beside him, tilting her head as she considered it. Her braids were pulled back in a practical ponytail, paint speckling her overalls from the morning's touch-ups. No, she said decisively. It honors the history while marking our chapter. I like it. She squeezed his hand, her wedding band pressing against his palm. Besides, 30 years of history gives us credibility in this neighborhood. We need every advantage we can get. Marcus nodded, feeling the familiar mixture of pride and anxiety that had been his constant companion throughout this journey. Across the street, a man exiting the artisanal coffee shop, one that had replaced a family-owned hardware store last year, stared at them openly before continuing on his way. Speaking of advantages, Marcus said quietly, has Gerald returned? Any of our calls about introducing us to the staff? Amara's expression tightened. 3 voicemails and 2 emails, nothing. She checked her watch. We've got 5 hours until opening, and Karen and the rest of the staff still don't know where the new owners. Inside the bistro, they'd transformed the space while respecting its bones. The original wood floors had been refinished, the bar lovingly restored. New lighting cast a warm glow over the dining room where Amara now moved between tables, making minor adjustments to the settings. Remember when the loan officer asked if we'd considered a less established neighborhood? She called to Marcus as he headed toward the kitchen. He laughed without humor. Which one? The first 4 who rejected us or the 5th who finally said yes? The one who said Oakwood Heights might not be the right fit for our concept. She straightened a napkin with unnecessary precision. As if your cuisine needed to be confined to certain zip codes. The memory transported Marcus back to that sterile bank office, the loan officer never quite meeting his eyes while suggesting that urban fusion cuisine might be better suited to a more diverse area. The implication had been clear. Chefs who looked like Marcus belonged in different neighborhoods. In the gleaming kitchen, the one place he'd insisted on completely renovating, Marcus ran his hand along the new countertops. From dishwasher, to line cook to sous chef to executive chef at restaurants owned by others, and now finally his own. He opened the refrigerator, checking the mise en place he'd prepared earlier. We did it, Dad, he whispered to himself, thinking of his father who'd worked 2 jobs to put him through culinary school, but hadn't lived to see this day. The sound of the back door opening interrupted his thoughts as Luis, his newly hired sous chef, arrived early. Chef, Luis greeted him with respect and excitement. Place looks amazing. Thanks for coming in early, Marcus said, genuine gratitude in his voice. He'd hired Luis away from one of the city's top restaurants, a coup d'etat that still surprised him. "I'm testing the special one more time. Want a taste?" As they worked, Marcus found himself sharing more than cooking techniques. 15 banks, he said, as he adjusted the heat under a pan of reducing sauce. 15 banks before we got the loan, even with Amara's corporate law, background and my executive chef credentials. Luis shook his head. "But you kept going." "Didn't have a choice," Marcus replied. "This is all I've ever wanted. My own place, my own menu. No more creating brilliant dishes for some white chef to take credit for." Across town, Karen Whitfield moved methodically through her pre-work routine. At 58, she'd refined it to an art over her 25 years at the Bistro. Her apartment walls were adorned with framed reviews of the restaurant, photos of special events, and mementos from regular customers who had become like family. She adjusted the framed photograph of herself and Gerald Simmons' father on the day he'd promoted her to head hostess. Thomas Simmons had been like a father to her after her own past, and she'd transferred that loyalty to Gerald when he inherited the restaurant. "Another day at our restaurant," she said to her reflection, as she applied her signature coral lipstick. Since David's death 5 years ago, these words had become something of a mantra, the restaurant filling the void left by her husband, and more recently, by her daughter's move across the country. The phone rang, her daughter Emily, calling for their weekly check-in. "The usual tonight?" Emily asked after they'd caught up. "Of course. Thursday is beef bourguignon night," Karen replied. The Bistro's weekly specials had structured her life for decades. "Gerald's been distracted lately, though. Keeps changing the schedule, disappearing for meetings. Between us, I'm a little worried about the books." After hanging up, Karen noticed an envelope that had been slipped under her door. Inside was a plain note card with typed text. "Be vigilant. Outsiders are changing the character of our neighborhood. Protect what matters." Karen frowned, then tucked the card into her purse. It wasn't the first such note to circulate in Oakwood Heights as luxury condos replaced historic homes and new businesses displaced old ones. She'd never participated in neighborhood gossip, but she understood the sentiment. Change was coming too fast, erasing the community she'd known. As she gathered her things, Karen paused at her small table where a Save Oakwood Heights flyer lay beside her bills. The neighborhood association meeting she'd missed had apparently been quite heated. Something about business permits being fast-tracked for diversity initiatives while longtime establishments struggled with rising rents. Karen sighed and headed for the door. At least the Bistro was safe. Gerald would never sell. It was his father's legacy. And if he ever did decide to retire, well, he'd surely offer it to her first. They'd discussed it hypothetically years ago, though she'd never been able to save enough for such a purchase. The thought of the Bistro changing hands made her stomach clench with anxiety. The restaurant was her world, the staff her family. Change might be inevitable in the neighborhood, but not at the Bistro. There, at least, traditions would be preserved. Back at the restaurant, Amara stood at the front window arranging flower displays when she noticed a woman across the street watching her intently. The woman quickly looked away when their eyes met, then whispered something to her companion. Both glanced back at the Bistro with expressions Amara recognized all too well, suspicion thinly veiled as curiosity. She'd encountered that look throughout her corporate law career, the subtle questioning of her presence in spaces where people who looked like her were rare. She'd hoped it would be different here, in their own establishment, but Oakwood Heights was proving to be exactly as challenging as their realtor had delicately suggested. A knock at the window startled her. A middle-aged Asian man smiled and waved. "We're not open until tonight," Amara called through the glass. The man motioned for her to come to the door. When she opened it, he extended his hand. "James Chen. My family owns Golden Dragon down the street. Wanted to welcome you properly to the neighborhood." Relief washed over Amara as she shook his hand. "Amara Johnson. My husband Marcus is in the kitchen. We've ordered from your restaurant 3 times this week during renovations." James laughed. "I know. My mother recognized your name on the orders. She insisted I bring this. He handed her a small plant. For prosperity and good fortune. Thank you, Amara said, genuinely touched. Would you like to come in? We could use a friendly face. Inside, James looked around appreciatively. You've maintained its spirit, smart move. That was important to us, Marcus said, emerging from the kitchen to join them. Respect the history while bringing something new. History is complicated in Oakwood Heights, James said carefully. When my parents opened our restaurant 30 years ago, someone broke our windows the first week. Now we're one of the neighborhood institutions the association wants to protect. He smiled wryly. It gets better, but not without a fight. After James left, Marcus checked his phone again. Still nothing from Gerald, he said, frustration evident. I'm going to try him again. The call went straight to voicemail. Gerald, it's Marcus Johnson again. We're opening in a few hours, and your staff still doesn't know about the ownership change. This isn't how we wanted to start. Please call me back. Amara was busy at her laptop when he returned. I've been going through the employee files Gerald finally sent over, she said. Karen Whitfield, the hostess, has been here 25 years, longer than Gerald himself. Marcus whistled low. That's serious dedication. She's the heart of the front of house, according to these notes. Amara turned the screen toward him, showing a staff photo. That's her. The image showed an older white woman with perfectly coiffed hair and a proud smile, standing beside a younger Gerald at what appeared to be a holiday party. Gerald should have told her himself, Marcus said. Told all of them. Well, he didn't, Amara replied pragmatically. So we'll do it right when they arrive for their shifts. Karen's scheduled to come in at 5 2 hours before opening. We'll walk her through everything, make her feel secure in her position. Marcus nodded, then checked the time. We should head home, clean up, and change for tonight. He surveyed the restaurant once more. Can you believe it? After tonight, we're officially restaurateurs. Amara stood and wrapped her arms around him. Chef owners, she corrected, and this place is lucky to have your vision. As they gathered their things to leave, the setting sun cast long shadows through the windows. Outside, Oakwood Heights continued its daily rhythms. Young professionals returning from work to their renovated townhomes, longtime residents gathering on stoops to discuss the neighborhood's changes, the constant tension between preservation and progress. Across town, Karen Whitfield put the finishing touches on her appearance, unaware that her world was about to change. She picked up her purse, checked that she had the key to the bistro, the key she'd carried for over 2 decades, and headed out, ready for another evening of upholding traditions in a neighborhood that seemed increasingly determined to forget them. The Bistro Part 2, the confrontation. The evening air had cooled considerably when Marcus and Amara returned to the bistro. Freshly showered and changed, they still opted for comfortable clothes, dark jeans and a navy button-down for Marcus, a flowing burgundy dress for Amara, knowing they faced hours of hard work before the night ended. Marcus slid his key into the lock, smiling at the small thrill it still gave him. My restaurant. Our restaurant. Wait until you taste the final version of the duck confit, he said to Amara as the door swung open. I adjusted the spice blend. And, excuse me, what do you think you're doing? The sharp voice cut through the quiet street. Karen Whitfield stood behind them, her expression shifting rapidly from confusion to alarm as she watched strangers opening the door to her restaurant. Stop right there. Karen moved quickly, positioning herself between them and the entrance, her hand clutching her purse strap so tightly her knuckles whitened. This is a private establishment. You can't just break in. Marcus raised his hands, slightly, an instinctive gesture he'd learned long ago when confronted with white fear. His voice remained measured, professional. Ma'am, there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Marcus Johnson, and this is my wife, Amara. We're the new owners of the bistro. Karen's eyes narrowed as she looked between them, her gaze lingering on the key still in Marcus's hand. New owners? That's impossible. Gerald would have told me. She turned to Amara. I've been the hostess here for 25 years. I know every single thing that happens at this restaurant. Gerald Simmons sold the bistro to us last month, Amara explained, her lawyer's calm still intact as she reached for her phone. I have all the documentation right here. I can show you. No. Karen stepped back, creating more distance between herself and Amara's extended phone. I don't know who you are or what scam you're running, but you're not getting into this restaurant. She fumbled in her purse and produced her own set of keys, clutching them protectively. If you were the new owners, Gerald would have introduced us. He wouldn't just... That was our expectation as well, Marcus interjected, his patient tone masking growing concern as he noticed a small group of pedestrians slowing to watch the interaction. We've been trying to reach Gerald all week about meeting the staff. Convenient, Karen scoffed, her voice rising. Gerald's family built this restaurant. He wouldn't sell it without telling me first. Her eyes darted to the new sign above, the door, widening slightly as she noticed the subtle changes. What did you do to the sign? Her voice had a new edge of panic. What have you done to our restaurant? Amara stepped forward, her diplomatic approach giving way to directness. Mrs. Whitfield, I understand this is surprising, but this is our restaurant now. We have every legal right to be here. She pulled up a document on her phone. Here's the deed transfer, and here's the business license with our names. Karen refused to look at the screen. Instead, she pulled out her own phone. I'm calling Gerald right now, and if he doesn't answer, I'm calling the police. Please do call Gerald, Marcus said, glancing at his watch. The first reservations would arrive in just over an hour. We've been trying to reach him ourselves. As Karen dialed, a sleek car pulled up to the curb. A woman in her 40s with striking silver-streaked black hair stepped out, her keen eyes immediately assessing the tableau before her. Is there a problem? She asked, approaching the group. I have a 6:30 reservation for the reopening. Eliza Washington. Marcus recognized the name instantly, the food critic whose reviews could make or break a new restaurant. He fought to maintain his composure. Ms. Washington, I'm Marcus Johnson, head chef and co-owner. We're just sorting out a small misunderstanding with our staff. We'll be ready for you shortly. Karen lowered her phone, her eyes widening at the critic's name. She'd seated Eliza Washington many times over the years, but rather than easing her suspicions, the presence of the influential critic seemed to heighten her alarm. Eliza, Karen said quickly, these people claim they've bought the bistro, they've changed the sign, they have keys. Gerald hasn't told me anything about this. Eliza Washington's expression remained carefully neutral as she looked between the parties. I received a press release about the ownership change last week, she said. That's why I'm here to review it. While Karen processed this information, Amara tried Gerald again. Still no answer, she muttered to Marcus before turning to Karen. Mrs. Whitfield, we had planned to arrive early specifically to meet with you before opening. We understand how valuable you are to this restaurant. Valuable? Karen's voice rose again. I am this restaurant. I've given my life to this place while Gerald was off playing golf with his friends. More passers-by had stopped now, forming a small crowd. Among them, Marcus spotted James Chen approaching with concern. What's happening? James asked, looking between them. Karen turned to him gratefully. James, thank goodness. These people are trying to break into the bistro. They claim they've bought it. James's expression shifted to recognition. Karen, these are the Johnsons. They did buy the bistro. I met them earlier today. They're legitimate restaurant owners. Karen stared at James, betrayal flashing across her face. You knew, and you didn't tell me? I assumed you knew, James replied. The sale has been in process for weeks. Something broke in Karen's composure. She stepped back, her breathing quickening as she looked around at the gathering crowd, at the change sign, at the strangers with keys to her sanctuary. No, she said, her voice trembling. No, this isn't right. She raised her phone again, but instead of dialing, she opened an app. I'm going live on Facebook. The community needs to know what's happening. Amara stepped forward, alarm replacing irritation. That's really not necessary. But Karen had already started the live stream, holding her phone up to capture everything. I'm standing outside the bistro where two individuals are attempting to enter the premises claiming they've purchased the restaurant. Her voice had taken on a performative quality, playing to an invisible audience. They've already altered our historic sign, and they're refusing to leave. Marcus felt a familiar sinking in his stomach, recognizing the dangerous territory they'd entered. He'd seen this before, how quickly a situation could transform when phones came out, how narratives could be established before truth had a chance. We're not refusing to leave our own restaurant, he said calmly, looking directly at Karen's camera. We are the legal owners of this establishment. Karen angled the phone away from him. The neighborhood has been changing too fast. Our beloved institutions are being taken over, and the character we've built over decades is being erased. Her voice pitched higher with emotion. I've called the police to protect the bistro's legacy. James Chen had taken out his own phone and begun recording. For balance, he said quietly to Marcus. So there's another perspective. The crowd had grown to nearly 20 people now, with more restaurant-goers arriving for reservations only to be caught in the unfolding drama. Eliza Washington had stepped back slightly, her reporter's notebook, now in hand, documenting everything with quick, efficient notes. Amara's patience had evaporated entirely. This is absurd, she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. We've invested our life savings in this restaurant. We have every legal right to be here. What you're doing right now, Mrs. Whitfield, is interfering with our business and potentially damaging our reputation before we've even opened. Karen flinched at Amara's directness but continued her live stream. I'm being told I have no right to protect the restaurant I've dedicated my life to. These are the changes happening all over Oakwood Heights. People with no connection to our history coming in and taking over. A murmur went through the crowd. Marcus recognized the dangerous current forming, the subtle coding of the situation into an us versus them narrative. He'd navigated these waters his entire career, but having it happen on the threshold of his own restaurant felt like a particularly cruel twist. A police cruiser pulled up, lights flashing but no siren. Officer Diane Rodriguez stepped out, her experienced eyes quickly scanning the scene, the crowd, the phones recording the tense standoff at the restaurant's entrance. What's going on here? She asked, approaching with measured steps. Karen immediately turned toward her. Officer, thank you for coming. These people are trying to break into the bistro. They claim they've bought it, but Gerald Simmons would never sell without telling me. And they've altered property without permission. Officer Rodriguez looked to Marcus and Amara. And you are? Marcus and Amara Johnson, Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the humiliation burning through him. We purchased the bistro from Gerald Simmons last month. We have all the documentation, deed transfer, business license, everything. We're supposed to open for dinner service in less than an hour. The officer nodded. May I see that documentation, please? Amara had already pulled up the files on her phone. She handed it to Officer Rodriguez, who reviewed them carefully. These appear to be in order, the officer said, returning the phone to Amara. Mrs. Whitfield, Karen Whitfield. I'm the hostess. I've been with the bistro for 25 years. Mrs. Whitfield, it seems there's been a communication issue, but these documents show the Johnsons are the legal owners of this establishment. Karen's live stream continued as she shook her head. There must be some mistake. Gerald wouldn't do this. A new voice cut through the tension. Karen, stop the live stream. The crowd parted to reveal Gerald Simmons, disheveled and breathing hard, as if he'd been running. His face was flushed with what might have been exertion or embarrassment. Gerald. Karen lowered her phone slightly, relief washing over her features. Tell them there's been a mistake. Tell them the bistro isn't sold. Gerald couldn't meet her eyes. Karen, please stop recording. Karen stared at him, the truth dawning slowly across her face. You didn't, she whispered. You wouldn't. I had to, Gerald said quietly. The restaurant was failing, Karen. I've been losing money for years. The Johnsons made a fair offer, and they're keeping all the staff, including you. Karen's hand fell to her side, though her live stream continued. You sold the bistro without telling me? Without telling any of us? Gerald finally looked up, addressing the crowd rather than Karen directly. I'd like to speak with my former employee privately. He turned to Marcus and Amara. I'm sorry about this. I should have handled it better. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. Let's clear this area, she said to the crowd. The restaurant will be open for business soon and this matter is being resolved. But the damage was already done. Dozens of people had witnessed the confrontation in person, and Karen's live stream had broadcast it to hundreds more. In the crowd, Eliza Washington continued making notes, her expression unreadable but her attention unwavering. Officer Rodriguez turned to the Johnsons. Do you want to press charges for disruption of business? She asked quietly. Marcus glanced at Amara, reading the fury in her eyes but also the calculation. Making an enemy of Karen would only deepen the rift they were trying to bridge in the community. Not at this time, he said, though the cost of his diplomacy was evident in the tightness around his eyes. We just want to open our restaurant. The officer nodded, then drew Karen aside while Gerald approached Marcus and Amara. I owe you both an apology, Gerald said, running a hand through his thinning hair. I kept putting off telling the staff, Karen especially. She's been here since my father ran the place. I couldn't face it. Your cowardice has put our opening night at risk, Amara said, her lawyer's precision making each word cut deep. Not to mention humiliated us in front of a crowd that included Eliza Washington. Gerald winced. I'll make a statement. To the staff, to anyone who saw the live stream. I'll make it right. That would be a start, Marcus said, checking his watch again. The kitchen staff would be arriving any minute, walking into a situation they hadn't been prepared for. But right now, we need to focus on salvaging this evening. Across the sidewalk, Officer Rodriguez was speaking firmly to Karen, whose face had crumpled from righteous indignation to devastation. The live stream had ended, but the damage continued to spread as comments and shares multiplied online. James Chen approached the Johnsons. I've got a counter-narrative started, he said, holding up his phone. Posted what I recorded with context about who you are, your culinary background, the legitimate sale. It might help. Thank you, Marcus said, genuine gratitude in his voice. We look out for each other, James replied. My parents went through something similar when they opened their restaurant. Different decade, same neighborhood dynamics. Eliza Washington approached next, notebook tucked away but her sharp gaze missing nothing. This is quite the opening night drama, she said. I'm still looking forward to the food, assuming you'll be able to open. We'll open, Marcus assured her, drawing on reserves of professionalism that had sustained him through countless kitchen crises. The food will speak for itself. Amara squeezed his hand, a silent gesture of solidarity before she turned to face the building challenges. The night they'd dreamed of, a smooth, triumphant debut, had shattered before it began. Now they faced salvaging not just an evening, but their reputation and investment. Officer Rodriguez returned with Karen, whose mascara had smudged beneath her eyes. Mrs. Whitfield has agreed to leave the premises peacefully, the officer said. She understands that the new ownership is legally established. Karen wouldn't look at Marcus or Amara. Her shoulders, so proudly squared during her confrontation, had collapsed inward, making her appear suddenly older and diminished. Karen, Marcus said, gentler than might have been expected, we'd still like to talk with you about your role at the bistro. Not tonight, obviously, but soon. Karen finally raised her eyes, red-rimmed but still defiant. This restaurant has been my life for 25 years, she said. You can't just walk in and understand what it means to this neighborhood. You're right, Amara conceded, surprising both Karen and Marcus. We can't understand yet. But we're committed to learning, to honoring the history while creating something new. That's why we kept the name, why we preserved so much of the interior. Karen's expression didn't soften. You changed the sign, she said, as if this alteration embodied everything she feared. We added to it, Marcus corrected gently, acknowledged both its history and its future. Officer Rodriguez placed a hand on Karen's arm. I'll drive you home, Mrs. Whitfield. I think you could use some time to process everything. She turned to the Johnsons. I'll need statements from both of you, but it can wait until tomorrow. As Karen allowed herself to be led to the police cruiser, Gerald approached her, speaking in low tones. Whatever he said caused her to pull away sharply, her pain transmuting once more to anger. You should have told me, they heard her say. After everything I've done for your family, for this restaurant, you should have told me yourself. With Dior, Karen and Officer Rodriguez departing, the crowd began to disperse. Some continued into the restaurant, determined to keep their reservations despite the drama. Others drifted away, already sharing what they'd witnessed with friends not present. Marcus took a deep breath and turned to face his restaurant, his dream, now baptized in conflict before it had even opened. Kitchen, he said to Amara, his voice finding its center. I need to check on the preparations and brief the staff before they walk into this mess. Amara nodded, her own professional mask sliding back into place. I'll handle the front of house and damage control with the guests. As they stepped through the door that had become a symbolic battleground, the weight of what had just occurred settled fully on their shoulders. The neighborhood's complex tensions, Karen's sense of betrayal, Gerald's cowardice, and their own outsider status had collided in the worst possible way, at the worst possible moment. The evening stretched before them like a gauntlet. Whatever happened next would define not just their opening night, but their place in Oakwood Heights for years to come. The moment the door closed behind them, Marcus leaned briefly against the wall, eyes closed, taking 3 deep breaths. A ritual he'd developed in hostile kitchens where showing weakness wasn't an option. Marcus. Amara's voice pulled him back, her hand warm on his arm. Despite the fury still evident in her eyes, her touch was gentle. We have about 10 minutes to decide what happens next. He straightened, professional instincts taking over. Kitchen first. They moved quickly through the dining room where early arrivals were already being seated by a visibly confused server. The elegant space they had so carefully prepared now felt like a stage set for a drama they hadn't rehearsed. In the kitchen, they found Luis, the sous chef, standing with the line cooks and dishwashers who had entered through the back entrance, all gathered around Tomas, the longtime prep cook. The conversation halted abruptly as they entered. Chef, Luis acknowledged, uncomfortable. We heard some commotion out front. And my phone's blowing up with notifications, Thomas added, holding up his screen where Karen's live stream was visible. Karen saying the restaurant's been sold without anyone telling the staff? Marcus centered himself in this space that should have been his sanctuary. Yes, my wife Amara and I purchased the Bistro from Gerald last month. We're your new owners, something Gerald should have told you himself weeks ago. The kitchen staff exchanged glances, absorbing the news with varying degrees of shock. So Karen didn't know either? Asked Maria, one of the line cooks who had worked alongside Karen for a decade. No one knew, Amara confirmed, her lawyer's precision cutting through confusion. Gerald Simmons chose not to inform his staff about the sale, creating the unfortunate situation you've just witnessed. What happens to our jobs? Thomas asked bluntly. Your jobs are secure, Marcus assured them. We've reviewed everyone's performance records. No one is being let go, and in fact we're planning to expand hours and staff as we grow. Relief rippled through the group, but uncertainty lingered. And Karen? Maria asked. Before Marcus could respond, the kitchen door swung open. Gerald entered first, followed by 2 servers and the bartender, the remainder of the evening's front-of-house staff. I've gathered everyone, Gerald said, his discomfort evident in his hunched shoulders. I owe you all an explanation. Yes, you do, Thomas said, crossing his arms. 20 years I've worked here, and you couldn't give me a heads up that you were selling the place? Gerald's face flushed. I made a mistake, several mistakes. He finally looked up, addressing the room. The truth is, the Bistro has been losing money for years. I kept it going out of obligation to my father, but each month put me deeper in debt. When the Johnsons made an offer, A very fair offer that included keeping all staff. I accepted. Then why not tell us? Luis asked. Gerald's gaze dropped, again. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, that I needed all the paperwork finalized first, but the truth is, I was a coward. I couldn't face Karen's disappointment or any of yours. The staff processed this in stony silence until Marcus stepped forward. I understand you're all feeling blindsided and betrayed, he said. That's completely justified. Gerald should have prepared you for this transition. He glanced at his watch. 40 minutes until opening. But right now, we have reservations for a full house, including one of the city's most influential food critics. So I'm asking you, will you work with us tonight? Give us a chance to show you who we are and what kind of restaurant we intend to run? Luis responded first, chef's pragmatism winning out. I'm here to cook, chef. Your kitchen, your menu. Thomas took longer before nodding slowly. 20 years I've worked these burners, not stopping tonight. One by one, the kitchen. Staff signaled their willingness to proceed, professional pride outweighing their shock. The servers and bartender followed suit, though with visible reservations. Marcus turned to Gerald. You should make yourself scarce for the remainder of the evening. Your presence will only complicate things further. Gerald nodded, shamefaced. I'll go, but I want to help fix this mess. Tomorrow I'll make public statements, contact anyone who saw Karen's video, whatever you need. We'll discuss that later, Amara said, her tone making it clear the conversation was over. As Gerald slipped out through the back door, Marcus addressed his team. 40 minutes, everyone. I know this isn't the opening night any of us imagined, but let's show Oakwood Heights what the Bistro is capable of. He clapped his hands once, the sharp sound breaking the tension. Stations! The kitchen erupted into rehearsed motion, professionals falling back on their training despite the chaos. Marcus caught Amara's eye across the room, a silent question passing between them. She gave him a firm nod. Yes, we're doing this. In the manager's office, Officer Rodriguez sat with Karen, whose live stream had ended, but whose phone continued to vibrate with notifications. I should go home, Karen said, her voice small and strained. I can't stay here. In a moment, Officer Rodriguez replied, not unkindly. First, I think you should see what's happening with your video. Karen reluctantly looked at her phone. The live stream had already accumulated over 2,000 views and hundreds of comments. Her face paled as she scrolled. Another Karen harassing black business owners. White lady calling cops on black people for existing again. This is exactly why we need the Business Diversity Initiative in Oakwood Heights. I'm not racist, Karen whispered, looking up with genuine distress. That's not what this was about. I was protecting the restaurant. From its legal owners, Officer Rodriguez observed neutrally. I didn't know they were the owners. And when they showed you documentation? Karen fell silent, the weight of her choices settling over her. I thought they were lying. Why would Gerald sell without telling me? Officer Rodriguez studied her carefully. Mrs. Whitfield, I've been an officer in this neighborhood for 15 years. I've seen how it's changed, the tensions that creates. I've also responded to numerous calls where misunderstandings escalated because of assumptions based on race. This wasn't about race, Karen insisted, but without conviction. Maybe not consciously, the officer acknowledged. But I have to ask. If the new owners had been white, would you have reacted the same way? Called the police? Started live streaming about protecting the neighborhood's character? Karen opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again, uncertainty flickering across her face. I don't think you're a bad person. Officer Rodriguez continued, softening. But tonight your actions put those business owners at risk. Calling the police on black citizens for non-criminal behavior has led to tragic outcomes in too many communities. Karen's hands trembled as she set down her phone. I didn't think. I was just so shocked. I understand that, but the consequences of your reaction will last beyond tonight. Officer Rodriguez stood. "I'll drive you home now. I recommend staying off social media for a while and considering deeply what happened here." In the dining room, Amara had transformed. From shocked new owner to poised restaurant manager with remarkable speed. Her corporate law background had prepared her for crisis management, and she now deployed those skills with precision. "We proceed as planned," she told the servers, her voice steady. Any guests who ask about the incident should be told simply that there was a misunderstanding about the ownership transition, which has now been resolved. Direct any pressing concerns to me personally. As the staff dispersed, James Chen approached, accompanied by an older Asian woman and several other local business owners. "Amara," James said, making quick introductions. "My mother insisted we come support your opening night. So did the Patels from the market and the Rodriguezes from the bakery." Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her keen eyes taking in the restaurant. "When my husband and I opened Golden Dragon 30 years ago, someone broke our windows the first week," she said matter-of-factly. "The second week, a health inspector came, anonymous complaint. The third week, our suppliers mysteriously canceled our orders." She smiled, the expression containing decades of hard-won wisdom. "We're still here. You will be too." Tears threatened at the unexpected solidarity, but Amara blinked them back. "Thank you, we've reserved your table by the window. The best in the house." As the Chen party moved to their seats, Eliza Washington approached, her critical gaze sweeping the restaurant. "Quite the dramatic start," she observed. "Most openings I attend are merely dull affairs with overcooked appetizers." Amara met her gaze directly. "Not the first impression we hope to make." "No," Eliza agreed, "but possibly more revealing than a carefully choreographed opening. I'll be interested to see how you and your husband navigate the evening." "The food will speak for itself," Amara said with quiet confidence. Eliza's lips quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "It always does, but so do other things. How you treat your staff during a crisis, how you respond to unexpected challenges." She glanced toward the entrance where Officer Rodriguez was escorting Karen out. "Will you be pressing charges?" The question caught Amara off guard. "We haven't decided," she said carefully. Eliza nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting choice ahead of you. Both paths make a statement about what kind of establishment you intend to run." With that, she moved to her table, notebook already in hand. Amara watched Karen's departure with complicated emotions. The woman had publicly humiliated them, potentially damaged their opening night, and cast racially charged aspersions on their legitimacy. Yet the devastation on her face as she left was unmistakable, the look of someone whose entire world had collapsed. Before she could dwell on it further, Marcus emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 exquisite plates. "First dishes for Eliza Washington," he said quietly, his chef's precision evident in every garnish. "Will you accompany me?" Together they approached the critics' table. Despite the chaos of the past hour, Marcus presented the dishes with calm professionalism, describing each component with the passion that had made him a rising star in the culinary world. "Duck confit with cherry gastrique, celeriac puree, and crispy kale," he explained, "followed by seared scallops with brown butter, sage, and roasted squash. The duck is a family recipe, refined through my years at Le Cirque." Eliza listened attentively, her expression giving nothing away. "Ambitious opening menu," she noted. "The best introduction to who we are," Marcus replied simply. As they returned to their stations, Marcus to the kitchen, Amara to the front of house, the restaurant settled into the rhythm of service. Servers moved efficiently between tables. The bar produced cocktails with theatrical flair and delectable aromas wafted from the kitchen. To an outside observer, the bistro might have appeared to be experiencing a perfectly normal, successful opening night. But beneath the professional veneer, the aftermath of the confrontation simmered. Servers whispered during brief moments out of guests' sight. Diners occasionally glanced at their phones, no doubt viewing snippets of Karen's livestream. Outside, curious onlookers peered through the windows drawn by the social media buzz. In the kitchen, Marcus conducted his team with focused intensity, channeling all his emotions, the humiliation, the anger, the determination, into creating perfect dishes. Each plate that left his hands was a statement. I belong here. We belong here. This is our restaurant. Near the end of the first seating, Officer Rodriguez returned, making her way to Amara at the hostess station. Mrs. Whitfield is home safely, she reported. I'll need statements from you and your husband, but it can wait until tomorrow. She hesitated, then added, Have you decided whether to press charges? Amara glanced across the restaurant to where Marcus was personally delivering a dessert to the Chen's table, his chef's whites pristine despite hours in the kitchen. Not yet, she admitted. There are complications. Officer Rodriguez nodded, understanding. There usually are in situations like this. For what it's worth, I think Mrs. Whitfield is beginning to understand the implications of her actions tonight. Sometimes consequences outside the legal system can be more effective in creating change. As the officer left, Amara found herself at a crossroads. The decision about Karen representing something larger than just one personnel issue. How they handled this crisis would define the Bistro's relationship with Oakwood Heights, either as outsiders demanding retribution or as new community members seeking reconciliation without sacrificing their dignity. The evening continued, service flowing more smoothly as the staff settled into their roles. By the time the last dessert was served and the last wine glass cleared, a cautious optimism had replaced the earlier tension. The food had been exceptional, the service recovered, its professionalism, and many guests made a point of complimenting the new owners before departing. As the final patrons left, Eliza Washington approached Marcus and Amara near the bar, where they had finally allowed themselves a moment's respite with much-needed glasses of wine. An illuminating evening, she said, tucking her notebook into her bag. My review will be published next Friday. And? Marcus couldn't help asking, professional curiosity overriding his usual restraint. Eliza's expression remained carefully neutral. I don't discuss my reviews before publication, Chef Johnson. But I will say this. You handled an extraordinarily difficult situation with grace. She glanced between them. Whatever you decide about Mrs. Whitfield, I suspect it will reflect the same thoughtfulness I observed tonight. After she left, Marcus and Amara sat in exhausted silence, the empty restaurant around them a testament to both their perseverance and the unexpected challenges they now faced. We survived, Marcus said finally, raising his glass in a small toast. Barely, Amara replied, clinking her glass against his. Now we have to decide what happens next. Marcus sighed, the weight of the decision regarding Karen settling between them. If we press charges, we make an enemy of someone who's worked here for 25 years. That affects staff morale, community perception, everything. If we don't, Amara countered, we risk appearing weak, letting racial harassment go unpunished. What message does that send? They fell silent again, the complexity of their position hanging in the air between them. Their dream restaurant had opened, but not in the way they had imagined. Instead of a celebration of Marcus's cuisine and their shared vision. The Bistro's new chapter had begun with a public confrontation that exposed the neighborhood's deepest tensions. As they contemplated their next move, their phones simultaneously buzzed with notifications. James Chen had posted his own video of the incident, providing context that Karen's live stream had lacked. The comments were already flooding in, creating a counter-narrative to the one that had initially taken hold. One decision at a time, Marcus said, setting down his glass. First, let's get through tomorrow's service, then we'll figure out what to do about Karen. Amara nodded, her strategic mind already mapping possible paths forward. The choice they faced was about more than just one disgruntled employee. It was about establishing what kind of presence they would be in Oakwood Heights and what kind of community they hoped to foster through their restaurant. Outside, the street had quieted, the neighborhood settling into night. The illuminated sign of the bistro cast a warm glow on the sidewalk. Est. 1993. Renewed. 2025. Despite the tumultuous opening, the promise of that renewal remained. Complicated, now by the evening's events, but perhaps more meaningful for having weathered its first storm. The dining room of the bistro hummed with energy. Clinking silverware, murmured conversations, and the choreographed movement of servers between tables. To an outsider, it might have appeared to be simply a successful opening night. But to Marcus, watching through the pass window, the undercurrents were unmistakable. At one table, longtime patrons scrutinized everything: the new menu, the subtle decor changes, the black chef owner who had created their meals. At another, younger diners snapped discreet photos, no doubt to share alongside thoughts about the earlier drama. In the corner, Eliza Washington methodically worked through the tasting menu, pausing between bites to jot notes in her leather book. "Chef," Luis called, pulling Marcus's attention back. "Order up for table 7. Marcus turned away from the window, centering himself in the familiar rhythm of the kitchen, his sanctuary, his domain. Here, regardless of what happened beyond these walls, he had always found solace. 2 duck confit, 1 scallop, 1 risotto, he called, reading the ticket. His hands moved with practiced precision, plating the duck with perfect cherry gastrique, the deep burgundy sauce creating an elegant arc across white porcelain. As he worked, Marcus felt the tightness in his chest loosen. Each plate was an affirmation, not just of his skill, but of his right to be here, to claim this space as his own. The confrontation had awakened old wounds, familiar doubts, but in the creation of his food, he found an expression that transcended the evening's ugliness. "Beautiful plate, chef," Luis murmured as the finished dishes headed out. Marcus nodded, already turning to the next order. "Let's keep the momentum. Table 9 needs their appetizers in 3 minutes. In the dining room, Amara moved between tables with a grace that belied her lingering tension. She had abandoned the hostess station to a server, recognizing that her presence as co-owner was needed throughout the space. Now she circulated, checking in with guests and fielding inevitable inquiries about the incident. "I heard there was some excitement earlier," a middle-aged woman said, her tone suggesting she was fishing for gossip. Amara offered her practiced response. "Just a misunderstanding during our transition of ownership. We're focused on making sure your dining experience is extraordinary tonight. How are you enjoying the roasted beet salad?" Most diners accepted the redirect, but Amara wasn't naive. She saw the sidelong glances, heard the whispered conversations when they thought she was out of earshot. The incident had become part of the restaurant's opening night narrative. As she approached the Chen family's table, James's mother reached out and caught her hand. "You stand tall," Mrs. Chen said, her grip surprisingly strong for such a petite woman. "When they tried to push us out 30 years ago, my husband wanted to change our menu to make it more American. I told him no, we cook food that honors our heritage, and those who appreciate it will come." She nodded toward the busy dining room. "Look at your husband's food. It speaks his truth. That is what matters." Amara squeezed the older woman's hand, unexpected emotion tightening her throat. "Thank you," she managed, before moving on, her spine a little straighter. The front door opened, and Amara turned to find herself face to face with Gerald, whose expression wavered between determination and discomfort. "Gerald," she said coolly, "I believe Marcus suggested you not return this evening." "I know," he said, glancing around the busy restaurant with evident surprise. "But I needed to do this properly." He held out a thick envelope. The contact information for all our vendors, the staff's personal phone numbers, and a letter for Karen if you decide to speak with her. He hesitated. "And I'd like to address the guests. Make a proper public statement about the ownership transition." Amara studied him, weighing the benefit against the risk of further disruption. Finally, she nodded. "Briefly. And I'll need to approve what you plan to say first." After a quick, tense conversation in the corridor, Amara led Gerald to the center of the dining room and clinked a spoon against a water glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment," she said. Gerald Simmons, the previous owner of the Bistro, would like to say a few words. Gerald stepped forward, his usual affable demeanor replaced by something more subdued, more authentic. Good evening. Many of you know me as the owner of the Bistro for the past 15 years. What you may not know is that I recently sold this restaurant to Marcus and Amara Johnson. He paused. I failed in my responsibility to properly introduce them to the community and to my staff, which led to the unfortunate incident some of you may have witnessed earlier this evening. A murmur ran through the dining room. I want to state publicly that the Johnsons are the legitimate and rightful owners of this establishment. They purchased it fairly, with plans to honor its traditions while bringing their own considerable talents to its future. Gerald turned toward Marcus, who had emerged from the kitchen. Chef Johnson is an award-winning culinary artist whose food speaks for itself tonight. I apologize for the difficult beginning to your new chapter, and I'm grateful for your commitment to maintaining the staff and spirit of the Bistro. The statement was short but unequivocal. Several tables broke into spontaneous applause as Gerald made a quiet exit, having finally done what he should have done weeks ago. Across town, Karen sat in her darkened apartment, the blue light of her phone illuminating her tear-streaked face. The live stream had now been viewed over 10,000 times, with comments continuing to pour in. For every message of support from neighborhood friends, there were 5 condemning her in no uncertain terms. Her daughter had called twice, having seen the video through friends' shares. The messages she'd left were increasingly concerned. "Mom, what were you thinking? Please call me back. This doesn't look good." Karen had been unable to return the calls. How could she explain what had happened when she herself was struggling to understand? The evening kept replaying in her mind. The shock of seeing strangers with keys to a restaurant, the reflexive protectiveness that had surged through her, the absolute certainty that she was defending something precious from interlopers. But now, with Officer Rodriguez's questions echoing and the public's reaction splashed across her screen, that certainty was crumbling. Would she have reacted the same way if the new owners had been white? The question haunted her because she couldn't honestly answer no. Her phone rang again. Patricia from the Neighborhood Association. "Karen? My God, are you all right? I just saw the video. I'm home. I don't know what I am. It's outrageous how they're treating you online," Patricia continued. "After all you've done for that restaurant, some of us are thinking of organizing a protest, show support for traditional businesses in the neighborhood." Karen felt a flicker of her earlier righteousness, quickly doused by the memory of Marcus Johnson's dignified restraint. "I don't think that's a good idea, Patricia." "What?" "But you've always been vocal about preserving the character of Oakwood Heights. This is exactly the kind of change we've been worried about." "Is it?" Karen found herself asking. "They kept all the staff. They preserved most of the interior. They're continuing the restaurant's legacy, just with their own vision." Patricia's voice cooled noticeably. "Well, I suppose if you're comfortable with the direction things are headed, that's your business. Some of us still care about maintaining standards." After they hung up, Karen stared at her phone, a hollowness opening within her. The call had clarified something she'd been avoiding. Beneath the talk of neighborhood character and traditional standards had always been an unspoken understanding of who belonged and who didn't. She'd never considered herself prejudiced. She'd always been pleasant to the handful of non-white customers who occasionally dined at the Bistro. But confronted with owners who didn't match her mental image of who belonged in her space, she had reacted with instinctive rejection. As this realization settled, Karen's phone pinged with a text from Maria, one of the line cooks. "The food is amazing tonight. You should see what he can do. It's still our Bistro, but better maybe. Miss..." "You hear?" The simple message broke something in Karen. She set down her phone and finally allowed herself to cry. For the restaurant that had been her anchor, for the self-image that had been shattered, and for the damage she'd caused with her unexamined assumptions. Back at the Bistro, the first seating was drawing to a close. Eliza Washington had finished her meal and was now conducting quiet interviews with the staff, her questions pointed, but fair. James Chen had introduced Marcus and Amara to several other business owners who had come to show solidarity, creating an impromptu network of support neither had expected to find on their first night. As servers cleared the last dessert plates, Marcus finally emerged fully from the kitchen, his chef's coat remarkably pristine despite the evening's labors. He moved through the dining room, stopping at each table to thank guests personally. The gesture was traditional but took on added significance, each conversation an opportunity to establish a direct connection that countered the viral narrative of conflict. When he reached Eliza Washington's table, she closed her notebook and regarded him thoughtfully. "Chef Johnson," she said, "your food managed to be both innovative and respectful of tradition. No small feat." "Thank you," Marcus replied, recognizing the significant compliment from the notoriously exacting critic. "That balance is exactly what we hope to achieve here." "Yes, I gathered that from more than just the cuisine." Eliza's keen eyes studied him. "Your restraint earlier this evening was noteworthy." Marcus understood she wasn't just referring to his cooking. The bistro has been part of this community for 30 years. Whatever happened tonight, that history deserves respect. As does your role in its future. Eliza rose, gathering her things. "I look forward to seeing how this restaurant evolves under your stewardship, chef. Tonight suggests it will be a journey worth following." As the dining room gradually emptied, Amara joined Marcus near the bar, both finally allowing their exhaustion to show. "We did it," she said softly, leaning against his shoulder. "We did," he agreed, his arm slipping around her waist. "Though not quite how we planned." "When does anything go exactly as planned?" Amara managed a small smile. "The food was extraordinary. You outdid yourself." "The front of house was flawless," he countered. "You handled everything they threw at you with grace." For a moment they stood in silence, absorbing the reality of having completed their first service as restaurant owners, however tumultuous the beginning had been. "Staff meeting," Marcus said finally. "They deserve our thanks after rallying like they did tonight." The kitchen and front of house teams gathered in the dining room, their professional demeanor softening as they settled into chairs. Marcus and Amara stood before them, partners in every sense. "I know this wasn't the opening night any of us expected," Marcus began. "But what you all accomplished tonight under extraordinary circumstances was nothing short of remarkable. We want you to know that we meant what we said earlier," Amara continued. "Your jobs are secure, your contributions are valued, and we're committed to making the bistro a place where everyone, staff and guests alike, feels welcome and respected." Thomas, the veteran prep cook, spoke up. "What about Karen? She's been the face of this place for longer than most of us have. Worked here?" Marcus and Amara exchanged a glance, the question they'd been avoiding now unavoidable. "We haven't made any decisions yet," Marcus said carefully. "What happened tonight was serious, but we understand it came from a place of shock and confusion. We'll be addressing it thoughtfully, not reactively." The staff seemed to accept this, and after a few more words of appreciation, they dispersed to complete their closing duties. As the last of them left for the night, Marcus and Amara finally collapsed into chairs, the adrenaline that had sustained them beginning to ebb. "Home?" Marcus suggested, his eyes heavy with fatigue. "Home," Amara agreed. The drive back to their apartment was quiet, both too drained to rehash the evening's events. But as they pulled into their parking space, their phones began buzzing, with notifications that had been accumulating while they focused on salvaging their opening night. Amara checked hers first, scrolling through with widening eyes. 3 interview requests from local media, a statement of support from the Black Restaurant Coalition, and a dozen reservation requests specifically mentioning they saw what happened and want to show their support. Marcus's phone showed similar messages along with texts from fellow chefs offering solidarity and practical advice for handling the publicity, both positive and negative, that was sure to follow. But it was a message from Officer Rodriguez that captured both their attention. Before you make any decisions about charges against Mrs. Whitfield, I'd like to suggest a mediated conversation. My precinct has a community justice program that might help resolve this situation in a way that addresses harm without escalating conflict. Your choice entirely, but worth considering. Available to discuss tomorrow. Inside their apartment, they fell onto their couch, the weight of the evening settling fully upon them. The opening night of their dream restaurant had become something they never anticipated, a public enactment of the very tensions they had hoped to navigate more quietly, more gradually. "What do you think about Rodriguez's suggestion?" Marcus asked, his voice revealing his exhaustion. Amara leaned her head against his shoulder. I think we need to sleep on it. Tonight showed us more about the community we've entered than we expected to learn so quickly. Maybe that knowledge can guide whatever comes next." Marcus nodded, his eyes already closing. The revelation of character, their own, their staff's, the community's, had been the unexpected gift of this chaotic beginning. The coming days would determine whether that revelation led to deeper division or the possibility of something new. A restaurant that honored its past while creating space for a different future. A community that faced its contradictions honestly. For tonight, however, they had survived. Their restaurant had opened. Their food had spoken for itself. And tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own opportunities for repair or rupture. "We did it," Marcus murmured again, the simple statement containing all the complexity of the evening, the triumph and the trial, the revelation and the resilience that had carried them through. "Yes," Amara agreed softly. "We did." 3 days after the incident, Marcus stood at the kitchen window of their apartment, coffee in hand, watching the early morning light transform the city. Behind him, Amara sat cross-legged on their sofa, her laptop open as she scrolled through yet another wave of messages. "CNN picked up the story," she said, her voice tight with disbelief. "There's a segment called Bistro Bias, Gentrification and Race in America's Restaurants." Marcus closed his eyes briefly. What had begun as a local incident had metastasized into something neither of them had anticipated. Karen's live stream had been edited, remixed, and shared across multiple platforms, spawning hashtags and heated debates about race, gentrification, and who had the right to claim community spaces. "The Washington Post wants an interview," Amara continued, "and 3 local news stations. Our reservation system crashed from the volume of requests." She looked up at him, conflicted. "We're booked solid for the next month." "Success for all the wrong reasons," Marcus replied, turning from the window. The restaurant had indeed been packed for the past 2 nights, but the atmosphere was exactly what they hadn't wanted. A mixture of rubberneckers hoping to witness drama and well-intentioned supporters making a point of their patronage. The food, his food, had become secondary to the spectacle. Their doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of Officer Rodriguez and Sharon Taylor, Marcus and Amara's lawyer. The conversation they'd been postponing could no longer be delayed. Once, settled in their living room, Sharon opened her portfolio decisively. "I've drafted a restraining order against Karen Whitfield," she began without preamble. "Given the public nature of her accusations and the potential damage to your business, we have a strong case. We should also pursue charges for interference with business operations." Officer Rodriguez's expression remained neutral, but her posture suggested disagreement. "Before you make that decision," she said, "I'd like to present an alternative. Our precinct has been piloting a community mediation program for situations exactly like this, conflicts that have legal dimensions, but are fundamentally about relationship repair within the community." "Relationship repair?" Amara echoed skeptically. "Officer Rodriguez, Karen Whitfield publicly accused us of breaking into our own restaurant. She called the police on us for existing in a space we legally own. That's not a relationship, that's racism." "I understand your perspective," Rodriguez replied carefully, "and you have every right to pursue legal action. I'm simply suggesting that there might be a more transformative path forward." "How would this mediation work?" Marcus asked, earning a sharp look from Amara. Rodriguez leaned forward. It would involve a structured conversation between you and Mrs. Whitfield, facilitated by a trained mediator. The goal isn't to minimize harm or force forgiveness, but to create space for genuine accountability and, if possible, healing. Sharon shook her head. My advice remains the same. Protect yourselves legally first. Consider reconciliation later, if at all. Marcus set down his coffee cup. I'd like to hear more about the mediation option. Amara studied him, recognizing a familiar pattern. Throughout their relationship, she had witnessed Marcus choose paths of reconciliation that sometimes exacted a personal toll. From the culinary school instructor who had sabotaged his final project to the executive chef who had taken credit for his recipe innovations, Marcus had consistently opted for conversations over confrontations. Sometimes it had led to genuine resolution, other times to lingering resentments that he bore in silence. Marcus, she said softly, we don't owe Karen our emotional labor. No, we don't, he agreed. But we do owe ourselves clarity about what we want the bistro to become in this community. If we go the legal route, we solidify the battle lines. We become the outsiders who came in and took down a beloved local figure, however justified. Sharon cleared her throat. If I may, there's also the practical business consideration. How you handle this will define your restaurant's reputation moving forward. Exactly, Marcus said. That's why I want to consider all options before we decide. Amara's phone buzzed with a notification. Eliza Washington's review just dropped, she announced, quickly scanning the article. She gave us 4.5 stars. She began reading aloud. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Chef Marcus Johnson's cuisine at the bistro represents exactly the kind of thoughtful evolution that keeps culinary traditions vibrant rather than static. His duck confit with cherry gastrique honors French bistro classics while introducing subtle personal influences that speak to his own journey as a chef. However, this review cannot ignore the circumstances surrounding the restaurant's opening night, circumstances that reveal the complex social dynamics at play in neighborhoods like Oakwood Heights, when longtime hostess Karen Whitfield confronted the new owners, mistaking them for intruders and calling police. She enacted a pattern all too familiar to people of color who enter spaces where they are not expected. How the Johnsons handled this fraught beginning with dignity and restraint speaks as much to their character as the excellence of their cuisine. The bistro now stands at a crossroads, as does Oakwood Heights itself. Will it become a case study in the painful collisions of gentrification, or a model for how communities can evolve while honoring both heritage and new voices? The answer may well depend on what happens next, but in the meantime, I strongly recommend the scallops. A heavy silence followed Amara's reading. The review was more than they could have hoped for, yet it placed a weight of expectation on them that neither had asked to carry. She's right, Marcus said finally. We're at a crossroads. Across town, Karen sat rigidly on her sofa as her daughter Emily paced the small living room, agitation evident in every movement. I had to take emergency leave from work, Emily said, her voice tight with contained emotion. Do you understand that, Mom? My boss called me in because your video was being shared in company Slack channels, with my last name clearly attached. Karen's hands twisted in her lap, her eyes downcast. The past 3 days had been a blur of phone calls, social media notifications, and conflicting messages from friends and neighbors. Some had rallied to her defense, praising her for standing up for the neighborhood. Others had distanced themselves entirely, including several longtime customers of the bistro who had made a point of posting their support for the Johnsons online. I'm sorry you were embarrassed, Karen said softly. Emily stopped pacing, staring at her mother in disbelief. Embarrassed? Mom, I'm not embarrassed. I'm horrified. Do you not understand what you did? I was protecting the restaurant. No. Emily cut her off, her voice cracking. You weren't protecting anything. You were acting out of fear and prejudice, and you need to own that. Karen flinched as if struck. I am not prejudiced. I have never... Remember Mrs. Okafor from down the street. The woman you always called the African lady, even though Dad and I told you 100 times she was from Nigeria and had a name? Remember how you clutched your purse tighter when those Latino teenagers got on the bus with us? Remember how you said James Chen's restaurant was surprisingly clean the first time we ate there? Each example landed like a blow. Karen opened her mouth to defend herself, then closed it again. Sudden, unwelcome memories surfacing. A lifetime of small moments she had never examined. Assumptions she had never questioned. Emily sat down beside her mother, taking Karen's hands in her own. "Mom, I love you," she said, her voice gentler now. "But you need to face this. What you did wasn't just about the bistro changing owners. It was about who you thought had the right to be in that space." Karen's eyes filled with tears. "I've given my life to that restaurant," she whispered. "I know. And that's what makes this so hard." Emily squeezed her mother's hands. "But your attachment doesn't give you ownership. And it doesn't excuse what happened." Karen nodded slowly, the full weight of her actions finally settling on her shoulders. "What do I do now?" Emily studied her mother, seeing both the woman who had raised her alone after her father died and the woman whose worldview had calcified in ways that had led to this moment. "You start by acknowledging the harm you caused," she said firmly. "Not just with words, but with actions. And then you do the work of examining why it happened in the first place." The next morning, Gerald Simmons arrived at the bistro before opening hours, finding Marcus and Amara preparing for another day of heightened attention. The previous owner's appearance was unexpected, his demeanor subdued as he handed Marcus an envelope. "What's this?" Marcus asked, not opening it immediately. "Compensation," Gerald replied, unable to meet their eyes. "For the trouble my silence caused. It's 3 months' worth of projected profits based on the previous year's earnings." Amara raised an eyebrow. "Buying your way out of guilt, Gerald?" He flushed but didn't retreat. "No. Making concrete amends for concrete harm. Money won't fix everything, but the incident cost you in real ways. This acknowledges that." Marcus studied the envelope, then set it on the counter unopened. "Thank you. But money isn't what we need most right now." Gerald nodded, understanding. "What can I do?" "You can start by helping us understand Karen better," Amara suggested, her legal mind already considering angles for the mediation they were now leaning toward. "You worked with her for years. What drives her? What might actually reach her?" Gerald considered the question seriously. "Karen's whole identity is wrapped up in this place. After her husband died, the bistro became her entire world. She doesn't just work here. She belongs here. Or at least she did." He paused, weighing his words. The change in ownership threatened that belonging in a way that intersected with other biases she might not even recognize in herself. "And what about you?" Marcus asked directly. "Why didn't you tell her about the sale yourself? The truth, this time." Gerald's shoulders slumped. "Because I knew exactly how she'd react. Not necessarily the police part, but the resistance, the sense of betrayal. And He trailed off, then forced himself to continue. "I didn't want to deal with her pain. It was cowardly." Amara's phone chimed with a message. She glanced at it, then showed it to Marcus. It was from Officer Rodriguez. "Mrs. Whitfield has agreed to mediation. Availability this week?" Marcus and Amara exchanged a long look, years of partnership allowing for a silent conversation that weighed risks against potential rewards, principles against pragmatism. "We'll do it," Marcus decided finally, Amara nodding her agreement after a moment's hesitation. "Not for Karen's sake, but for our own closure. And for the restaurant." That afternoon, they closed the bistro for a rare staff meeting before service. The team gathered in the dining room, curious about the purpose of the assembly. "We've made a decision regarding Karen," Marcus announced, standing beside Amara at the head of the room. "We're going to participate in a mediated conversation with her later this week." Murmurs rippled through the staff, some nodding approval, others looking skeptical. "Does that mean she's coming back to work?" Maria asked directly. "We haven't decided that yet," Amara replied honestly. The conversation will help determine next steps. Some of us have been getting messages from customers about it, Luis added. People asking us to take sides. It's getting uncomfortable. Marcus nodded, understanding. The incident has divided the community in ways we never intended. That's part of why we're pursuing mediation, to try to find a path forward that doesn't deepen those divisions. Tomas, who had been quiet until now, cleared his throat. I've worked with Karen for 20 years, he said slowly. What she did was wrong. But she's also been the heart of this place for a long time. People make mistakes. Calling the police on black people for existing isn't just a mistake, countered Deshawn, one of the younger servers. It's dangerous. It could have gone very differently if Officer Rodriguez hadn't responded. The conversation continued, revealing the complex feelings among the staff. Loyalty to a longtime colleague balanced against recognition of the serious harm her actions had caused. Marcus and Amara listened carefully, understanding that their decision would affect not just their relationship with Karen, but the entire ecosystem of the restaurant. We appreciate your perspectives, Amara said finally. Whatever happens next, we want the bistro to be a place where everyone, staff and customers alike, feels valued and respected. That's our non-negotiable commitment. After the staff dispersed to prepare for service, Marcus and Amara retreated to the office to compose their response to Officer Rodriguez. As they worked, their phones buzzed simultaneously. A group text from James Chen with a link to a social media campaign that had emerged overnight. Stand with the bistro, Amara read aloud, scrolling through posts from local minority business owners expressing solidarity with Marcus and Amara. Each post featured the owner standing before their establishment, many sharing their own stories of facing resistance when they first opened. James organized this, Marcus noted, impressed by the rapid mobilization of support. Before they could absorb it fully, another notification arrived, this one from a neighborhood association member they'd met briefly, sharing a different hashtag, campaign, Protect Oakwood Traditions, featuring posts defending Karen and lamenting the changing character of the neighborhood. Battle lines drawn, Amara murmured, closing her phone with a sigh. Exactly what we didn't want. Marcus squeezed her hand. Then let's forge a different path. Let's see if this mediation can create something unexpected. You really believe reconciliation is possible? Amara asked, her skepticism evident. After everything that's happened? Marcus considered the question carefully. I don't know, he admitted. But I do know that the alternative, digging in, fueling the conflict, won't create the restaurant we want to run or the community we want to be part of. Amara nodded slowly, her pragmatic legal mind finding unexpected common ground with Marcus's more intuitive approach. All right, she said finally. We'll try the mediation, but I want to be clear about our boundaries going in. This isn't about absolution for Karen. It's about finding a way forward that honors the harm done while creating space for something new. Agreed, Marcus said, turning back to their email to Officer Rodriguez. They began crafting their response, setting the parameters for what would undoubtedly be a challenging conversation, one that would test their own capacity for balancing accountability and compassion, justice and transformation. Whatever emerged from the mediation would shape not just Karen's future, but the identity of the bistro itself. Would it become another flashpoint in the neighborhood's ongoing tensions, or could it somehow become a model for navigating the complex intersection of race, belonging, and community change? As they finalized their message, both understood that the answer would depend not just on Karen's willingness to confront her actions honestly, but on their own ability to hold firm to their dignity while remaining open to the possibility of genuine growth, Karen's, the community's, and perhaps even their own. The community center conference room had been deliberately arranged to feel neutral, a round table, soft lighting, a small arrangement of flowers in the center. But despite these efforts, tension filled the air as Marcus and Amara sat across from Karen Whitfield, with Officer Rodriguez and mediator Gabriela Morales positioned between them. Karen looked smaller somehow, her usual immaculate appearance slightly diminished. Beside Marcus, Amara maintained her composure through controlled breathing and rigid posture. Thank you all for agreeing to this conversation, Gabriela began. I want to clarify that this is not about forcing forgiveness or manufacturing reconciliation. This space is for honest dialogue about what happened, why it happened, and what might be possible moving forward. Officer Rodriguez nodded. My role today is simply to provide context when needed, not to adjudicate. After establishing ground, rules about speaking from personal experience, listening without interrupting, and focusing on impact rather than just intention, Gabriella turned to Karen. Would you like to begin by sharing your understanding of what happened and why we're here today? Karen folded her hands tightly on the table. I'd like to apologize for the misunderstanding at the restaurant, she began, her voice thin. I never intended to cause such a scene. I was just shocked to see strangers entering the bistro with keys, and I reacted out of concern for the restaurant's safety. Marcus kept his expression neutral, noting that Karen had framed the incident as a misunderstanding rather than acknowledging the racial dynamics. I've worked at the bistro for 25 years, Karen continued. It's been my whole world, especially since my husband passed. When I saw you two at the door, I didn't know Gerald had sold the restaurant. I was just trying to protect what I care about. Amara spoke first in response, her lawyer's precision evident. I appreciate that you care deeply about the bistro, Karen, but what happened wasn't simply a misunderstanding. You refused to look at our documentation. You called the police. You live-streamed accusations about us changing the character of the neighborhood. Those actions have specific connotations when directed at Black business owners. Karen flushed. That wasn't my intention. I understand that wasn't your conscious intention, Amara continued steadily. But impact matters more than intention in situations like this. The impact was that we were publicly humiliated and potentially endangered on what should have been one of the proudest nights of our lives. A heavy silence fell. Karen looked down at her hands, visibly struggling with how to respond. Marcus decided to shift the conversation. Karen, I've worked in kitchens my entire adult life. I started as a dishwasher and worked my way up through every station. In almost every kitchen, I was one of the few black faces not relegated to prep or dish duty. He paused. Throughout my career, I've had to work twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. I've had recipes stolen by white executive chefs. I've been passed over for promotions that went to less qualified candidates. He leaned forward slightly. That night at the bistro, the moment you refused to even look at our documentation, I knew exactly what was happening. It wasn't new to me. It was just particularly painful because this was supposed to be different. This was supposed to be our restaurant, the place where we finally didn't have to prove we belonged. Karen's eyes had filled with tears, but Marcus wasn't finished. I need you to understand that your reaction wasn't just about protecting the bistro. It was about who you believed had the right to own it. Karen wiped at her eyes. I'm sorry. I never thought of myself as prejudiced. I've always tried to treat everyone the same. Amara shook her head. Treating everyone the same ignores the reality that we don't all start from the same place or face the same obstacles. When you saw us at the door, you didn't see restaurant owners. You saw threats. Officer Rodriguez gently interjected. Karen, can you share more about what was going through your mind when you first encountered Marcus and Amara? Not what you think now, in retrospect, but what you felt in that moment. Karen took a shaky breath. I saw two people I didn't recognize using keys to enter. My first thought was that they were breaking in. She hesitated, then continued with difficulty. But I think if they had been white, I might have been more likely to consider other explanations first. I might have asked questions before reacting so strongly. The admission hung in the air, its honesty creating the first genuine opening in the conversation. Thank you for that recognition, Gabriella said. That's an important step. She turned to Marcus and Amara. What was that moment like for you? Amara spoke again, her composure momentarily slipping. It was humiliating, it was infuriating, and it was exhausting. She pressed her hands flat against the table. Do you know what it's like to constantly have to prove you belong in spaces? To have your legitimacy questioned at every turn? To watch people clutch their bags tighter when you enter an elevator, Or have sales associates follow you around stores? She looked directly at Karen. That night wasn't an isolated incident for us. It was one more instance in a lifetime of instances, and that's what makes it so difficult to just accept an apology and move on. Because the harm isn't just what happened that night, it's the cumulative weight of similar experiences throughout our lives. Karen nodded slowly, her defensiveness giving way to reflection. I've been thinking about what my daughter said to me. She pointed out patterns in my behavior that I never examined. Things I said or did without realizing what they revealed about my assumptions. She looked up, meeting Amara's gaze directly. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just trying to understand how I became someone who would do what I did. Marcus felt a subtle shift in the room's energy. Not a resolution, but perhaps the beginning of one. I think that's a question many people never ask themselves, he said. And it's an important one. Officer Rodriguez spoke again. Karen, can you tell us more about your connection to the bistro and what it represents for you? Karen's expression softened. When my husband died 5 years ago, the bistro became everything to me. More than a job, it was where I felt valued, respected, needed. She twisted her wedding ring. As the neighborhood started changing, with new businesses and new people moving in, the bistro remained constant. It was the one place where everything stayed the same, where I still knew my place in the world. Her voice grew quieter. When my daughter moved away last year, it became even more important. The regulars became my family. The routines became my anchor. She looked up. So when you appeared that night, it wasn't just about the restaurant, changing owners. It was about the last stable thing in my life being taken away without warning, and that fear manifested in assumptions about who should or shouldn't own the bistro, Gabriella observed. Karen nodded reluctantly. Yes. Amara studied Karen thoughtfully. I understand feeling like something precious is being taken from you. What I need you to understand is that by calling the police, by live streaming accusations, you weren't just expressing fear. You were leveraging systems that have historically been used to exclude people who look like us from spaces like the bistro. I didn't think of it that way, Karen admitted. I just reacted. That's precisely the problem, Amara replied. Not thinking about the implications of calling police on black people is a luxury we don't have. We have to consider those implications constantly because the consequences for us can be life-threatening. The room fell silent again as Karen absorbed this. Marcus watched the slow transformation in her expression, discomfort giving way to painful recognition. I've been reading articles people sent me, Karen said eventually, about how calling the police on black people for non-crimes has led to tragedy. I honestly never made that connection until afterward. She pressed her lips together. I'm sorry. That sounds inadequate, but I am truly sorry for putting you at risk that way. For the first time, her apology addressed the specific harm, and Marcus felt something in his chest loosen slightly. Thank you for acknowledging that, he said. Gabriella nodded encouragingly. Marcus, can you share more about your journey so Karen might better understand the context in which this incident occurred? Marcus decided honesty was the only path forward. I grew up watching my father work 2 jobs after my mother died. He emphasized education and hard work as the keys to success. But he also prepared me for a reality he knew all too well, that those things wouldn't always be enough. He described his early kitchen experiences, from the culinary school instructor who graded his identical dishes lower than his white classmates, to the sous chef position he lost to a less experienced white applicant, to the investors who questioned whether a soul food influence would limit the appeal of his restaurant concept. The pattern is always the same, he explained. Your qualifications are questioned, your belonging is challenged, and through it all, you're expected to remain professional, to never show anger or frustration, because that would only confirm the stereotypes people already hold. Karen was listening intently. I never understood, she said softly. I mean, I knew racism existed, but I thought of it as something obvious and intentional, not as the water we all swim in, Amara supplied. not as the unconscious biases that shape how we perceive and interact with the world. Karen nodded. Yes, exactly. Officer Rodriguez spoke up. This reminds me of conversations we've been having in the department about community policing, about recognizing that even when we intend to serve and protect everyone equally, our perceptions of threat and danger are influenced by broader cultural narratives. It's a starting point, Gabriela affirmed. Recognizing these dynamics is necessary, though not sufficient, for change. She turned to Marcus and Amara. Given everything that's been shared, what would meaningful accountability look like to you? Marcus and Amara exchanged a glance, having discussed this extensively before. First, Amara began, a public acknowledgement of what happened and why it was harmful. Not a generic apology for a misunderstanding, but a specific recognition of how racial bias factored into your actions. Second, Marcus continued, some form of education, not just for Karen but for the broader community. This incident exposed tensions that go far beyond one confrontation. And third, Amara concluded, concrete actions that demonstrate a commitment to change, not just stated intentions. Karen nodded slowly, though apprehension flickered across her face at the mention of a public statement. I understand. I'm willing to do those things, though I'm scared of the public part. The online reaction has been overwhelming. Fear is understandable, Gabriela acknowledged. But accountability often requires discomfort. Karen hesitated. What about my job? I know I have no right to expect, but the bistro has been my life for so long. Marcus and Amara had discussed this extensively but had deliberately left it open. We haven't made a final decision, Marcus said carefully. A lot depends on today's conversation and what follows from it. Amara added, the trust that was broken isn't easily repaired. Whatever happens, it couldn't be the same role as before. The dynamics have fundamentally changed. Karen nodded, accepting this without protest. I understand. Regardless of what you decide about my position, I want to make things right. Not just for my sake, but because what happened exposed something important about our community that needs to be addressed. As the mediation continued, they moved into more specific territory, drafting language for Karen's public statement, discussing educational resources about racial bias, and exploring concrete actions to rebuild trust. There were difficult moments, points where Karen retreated into defensiveness, where Amara's patience wore thin, where the gap between their experiences seemed unbridgeable. But each time, with Gabriela's skilled guidance and Officer Rodriguez's insights, they found their way back to honesty without cruelty, accountability without dehumanization. By the time the scheduled 2 hours had elapsed, all 4 participants showed signs of emotional exhaustion. They had not reached perfect resolution, but they had established a framework for moving forward. Before we conclude, Gabriela said, I'd like each of you to share one insight you're taking from today's conversation. Karen spoke first. I'm realizing that good intentions aren't enough, that I need to examine the assumptions behind my reactions, and that causing harm doesn't make me a terrible person, but refusing to acknowledge that harm would. Amara nodded slightly. I'm recognizing the difference between forgiveness and moving forward, that we can create a new relationship without pretending the past didn't happen. Marcus considered carefully. I'm thinking about the difference between individual change and community change, that what happened at the bistro isn't just about the 4 of us in this room, it's about patterns that exist throughout Oakwood Heights and beyond. Officer Rodriguez completed the circle. I'm reminded of why I became a police officer, not just to enforce laws, but to help create a community where everyone feels safe and valued. That work happens in conversations like this one, not just in crisis response. As they prepared to leave, Karen approached Marcus and Amara directly. Her posture was different now, not pleading or defensive, but holding a new awareness of the space between them. Thank you, she said simply, for being willing to have this conversation when you had every right to refuse. It doesn't undo what happened, but it matters, at least to me. Marcus nodded. his expression serious but not unkind. It matters to us too. What happens next will determine how much. Outside the community center, supporters from both sides had gathered, separated by an unspoken boundary that mimicked the neighborhood's own divisions. As they emerged, the groups watched expectantly, hungry for signs of either reconciliation or continued conflict. Instead of the clear resolution they sought, they witnessed something more nuanced. Three people who had begun the difficult work of truth-telling, their expressions reflecting not the satisfaction of problems solved, but the particular exhaustion that comes from confronting long-avoided realities. It was a beginning, not an ending. And as they parted ways, Karen toward her daughter who waited nearby, Marcus and Amara toward their car, the question of what role, if any, Karen might play in the bistro's future remained open. But something had shifted, creating space for possibilities that hadn't existed before the conversation began. The real test would come in the days ahead, as words gave way to actions, as private reckonings manifested in public commitments, as the community itself confronted the larger truths that one restaurant's story had brought to the surface. The Oakwood Heights Community Center auditorium had not been this full in years. Every seat was taken with additional residents standing along the walls, spilling out into the hallway. The emergency town hall called by the neighborhood association to discuss what was now commonly referred to as the Bistro incident had drawn a crowd that reflected the area's changing demographics. Longtime residents in their 60s and 70s mingled with young professionals and families, the racial makeup more diverse than would have been seen even 5 years earlier. Marcus and Amara sat in the third row, painfully aware of the occasional glances cast their way. They had debated whether to attend at all, but ultimately decided their presence was necessary. Beside them sat James Chen and his mother, along with several other minority business owners who had formed an informal alliance in the weeks following the incident. At the back of the room, Karen Whitfield sat with her daughter Emily, her expression solemn as she surveyed the crowd. Her public statement, crafted during the mediation and published on both social media and in the local paper, had garnered mixed responses, praise from some for its honesty, criticism from others who felt it either went too far or not far enough. Patricia Winters, the president of the neighborhood association, called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to managing contentious gatherings. "The events at the Bistro 2 weeks ago have sparked important conversations about our community's values and future. This town hall is an opportunity to air perspectives and concerns in a respectful manner." She gestured to a sign listing ground rules. 2-minute speaking limit, no personal attacks, focus on solutions. "I'll now open the floor for comments," Patricia announced, indicating the microphone stand positioned in the center aisle. The first speaker was an elderly man who had lived in Oakwood Heights for over 40 years. He approached the microphone with slow, deliberate steps. "I've watched this neighborhood change a lot," he began, his voice slightly tremulous with age. "Some for the better, some not. What happened at the Bistro is unfortunate, but I think we're missing the bigger picture. This neighborhood has traditions, character. We're losing that with all these new businesses that have no connection to our history." A murmur of agreement rose from one section of the audience. "The problem isn't change itself," the man continued. "It's the pace of change, the lack of respect for what came before. I think people are too quick to cry racism when it's really about preserving our community's unique identity." As he returned to his seat, Amara felt Marcus tense beside her, his jaw tightening at the familiar coded language. She placed a hand on his knee, a silent reminder of their agreement to observe before engaging. The next speaker was a young woman who had moved to the neighborhood 3 years ago. "With all due respect to the previous speaker, I have to ask, whose traditions are we talking about preserving? Whose character?" Her voice was clear and confident. "I've read about the history of Oakwood Heights. Until the 1980s, restrictive covenants effectively prevented non-white residents from buying homes here. So when we talk about neighborhood character, we need to be honest about what that has historically meant." A different sort of murmur rippled through the crowd, some uncomfortable shifting, some nodding in agreement. Speaker after speaker approached the microphone, the perspectives as varied as the community itself. A retired school teacher lamented the loss of businesses where everybody knew your name. A young father described feeling unwelcome at neighborhood events because his children were biracial. An older woman insisted the entire incident had been blown out of proportion by social media. A middle-aged man suggested that people were too sensitive these days. Throughout it all, Marcus and Amara listened, their expressions carefully neutral despite the emotional weight of the discussion. This was not new territory for them. They had navigated these conversations throughout their professional lives, but experiencing it as the focal point was different, more intimate somehow. Nearly an hour into the meeting, James Chen rose and walked to the microphone. Unlike previous speakers, he carried a folder of papers, which he now opened deliberately. "My name is James Chen. My family has owned Golden Dragon Restaurant on Maple Street for 30 years. He adjusted his glasses. "After the Bistro incident, I began researching the history of minority-owned businesses in Oakwood Heights. What I found was a pattern that can't be explained by normal market forces." He held up a graph. "In the past 20 years, minority-owned businesses in this neighborhood have failed at 3 times the rate of white-owned businesses, despite similar startup capital and experience levels." He paused, allowing the information to sink in. "But here's what's interesting. It's rarely due to overt discrimination. Instead, it's what I call soft resistance." James flipped to another page. "Anonymous complaints to health inspectors occur 6 times more frequently against minority-owned establishments. Permit approvals take an average of 2 months longer. Minority business owners report customers questioning their prices, expertise, or authenticity at significantly higher rates." The room had gone completely silent, the data cutting through rhetoric to expose uncomfortable patterns. "What happened at the Bistro wasn't an isolated incident," James concluded. "It was a visible manifestation of subtle dynamics that have shaped this neighborhood for decades. The question isn't whether these patterns exist, the data is clear. The question is what we intend to do about them." As James returned to his seat, Gerald Simmons rose unexpectedly from the middle of the audience and made his way to the microphone. The former owner of the Bistro looked uncomfortable but determined. "I wasn't planning to speak tonight," he began. "But after listening to Mr. Chen's presentation, I feel I need to acknowledge my own role in what happened." He cleared his throat. "I sold the Bistro to Marcus and Amara Johnson because they were the most qualified buyers with the best vision for its future. But I failed to properly introduce them to the staff and community, partly because I was conflict avoidant, and partly because," he hesitated, "because I anticipated resistance to the change in ownership." Gerald's admission hung in the air, its honesty compelling. "I convinced myself I was being pragmatic, but the truth is, I was complicit in the very dynamics Mr. Chen just described. My silence enabled the confrontation that followed, and for that I apologize not just to the Johnsons, but to the entire community." As Gerald stepped away, the mood in the room shifted subtly. His public accountability had opened space for more honest reflection. Patricia returned to the microphone. "I believe we have time for a few more speakers before we discuss next steps." To everyone's surprise, Karen Whitfield rose and made her way to the microphone. A hush fell over the audience as she adjusted the stand to her height. "Most of you know who I am," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm the person who called the police on the Johnsons that night. I've already issued a public statement, but I want to say directly to this community that I recognize the harm my actions caused." She took a deep breath. "Listening tonight has been difficult but necessary. I've lived in Oakwood Heights my entire life, and I never considered myself prejudiced. But what I'm realizing is that I had very fixed ideas about who belonged in my restaurant, in my neighborhood." She made air quotes around the possessive pronouns, acknowledging their problematic nature. "The mediation process with Marcus and Amara was one of the most challenging experiences of my life. It forced me to confront assumptions I didn't even know I carried." She looked directly at the Johnsons. "I'm still learning, still making mistakes, but I'm committed to being part of the solution." not continuing to be part of the problem. As Karen returned to her seat, the tension in the room had transformed, not dissolved, but shifted into something more reflective, more complex. After a few more speakers, Eliza Washington was recognized. The food critic had been quietly observing from a corner of the room, notebook in hand. "I've been covering the restaurant scene in this city for 15 years, she began. "And what I've observed is that food is never just about food. It's about culture, identity, belonging. The resistance that minority chefs and restaurateurs face isn't just about their cuisine. It's about who gets to claim authority over taste and tradition." She closed her notebook. "My follow-up piece on the Bistro will be published tomorrow. It examines how the incident reflects broader patterns in our city's dining scene. But beyond the article, I'm announcing the launch of a new series highlighting the often overlooked contributions of chefs of color to our local food culture. Because representation matters, in kitchens as much as anywhere else." Patricia checked her watch. "We have time for one final speaker before we move to the action items portion of our agenda." Marcus, who had been listening intently throughout the evening, suddenly rose from his seat. Amara looked up at him, surprised. They had agreed to observe rather than participate, but something in her husband's expression told her this moment mattered. As Marcus approached the microphone, the room fell completely silent. He stood for a moment, gathering his thoughts, the weight of the community's attention palpable. "I didn't come here tonight planning to speak," he began, his chef's voice carrying easily through the room. "Amara and I came to listen, to understand the community we've joined. But after everything I've heard, I feel compelled to share a perspective that might bridge some of the divides I'm witnessing." He looked around the room, making eye contact with various residents. "I understand the fear of change. I understand the desire to preserve what matters. The restaurant I bought is called the Bistro because I respected its 30-year legacy. I kept much of the interior intact because I valued the history embedded in those walls." Marcus paused, carefully choosing his next words. "But tradition, without evolution, becomes stagnation. In cooking, we call this principle honoring the foundation while bringing fresh interpretation. The best dishes respect their origins while finding new expressions that speak to the present moment." His voice grew more passionate. "When I create a menu, I draw on French techniques I learned in culinary school, flavors from my grandmother's kitchen in Georgia, ingredients I discovered while traveling in Asia. The result isn't a dilution of tradition. It's an enrichment, a conversation across experiences that creates something new while honoring what came before." Many in the audience were nodding now, the culinary metaphor providing a language to discuss more difficult concepts. "Oakwood Heights stands at a crossroads," Marcus continued. "You can view new residents, new businesses, new ideas as threats to tradition, or as ingredients that might create something remarkable if incorporated thoughtfully. The question isn't whether change will happen, it's whether that change will be resisted at every turn, or shaped collectively into something that serves everyone." He straightened slightly. "What happened at our opening night was painful, but it has created an opportunity for this community to have conversations that were long overdue, to examine assumptions that have gone unquestioned, to reimagine what neighborhood character might mean if it embraced diversity rather than resisting it." Marcus gestured toward James Chen. "The data Mr. Chen presented tonight isn't just about the past. It's about choices this community faces now. Will minority business owners continue to face soft resistance until they give up and leave? Or will Oakwood Heights become a place where all entrepreneurs have equal opportunity to contribute to the neighborhood's next chapter?" His final words resonated through the silent room. "At the Bistro, our motto is Est 1993, renewed 2025. It honors both history and possibility. Perhaps that's a model for this community as well, acknowledging its origins while embracing renewal rather than fearing it." As Marcus returned to his seat, the applause began, not universal but substantial. More importantly, the quality of attention in the room had changed. His words had offered a framework that acknowledged valid concerns about preservation while challenging the underlying assumptions about who belonged in the community's future. Patricia returned to the microphone, visibly moved despite her effort to maintain a neutral facilitator's demeanor. Thank you, Chef Johnson. That perspective gives us a powerful lens through which to consider our next steps. She consulted her notes. The board has proposed the formation of a business district committee focused specifically on creating a more inclusive environment for all entrepreneurs in Oakwood Heights. She outlined the proposed committee's structure and responsibilities, emphasizing that it would need diverse representation to be effective. We're seeking volunteers who can commit to monthly meetings and concrete action steps. If you're interested, please sign up at the table by the door after we adjourn. As the formal meeting concluded, the room buzzed with conversation. Some residents left immediately, uncomfortable with the evening's revelations. Others formed small discussion groups, the dialogue continuing with newfound frankness. And at the volunteer table, a line began to form, an encouraging mix of longtime residents and newcomers, white faces and faces of color. Marcus and Amara found themselves surrounded by well-wishers and potential allies, including several restaurant owners who expressed interest in joint community initiatives. James Chen approached with his mother, both smiling. That was quite a speech, James said, extending his hand to Marcus. I didn't know we had a philosopher chef in the neighborhood. Marcus smiled ruefully. Just a guy who thinks a lot while chopping vegetables. Mrs. Chen patted his arm. Food and community, same thing. Both need many ingredients, careful balance, time to develop flavor. Her eyes twinkled. And sometimes, hot flame to catalyze transformation. Across the room, Karen hesitantly approached, the volunteer table aware of the stares following her. Emily squeezed her mother's arm encouragingly as Karen wrote her name on the committee sign-up sheet, committing herself to the difficult work ahead. As the crowd thinned, Marcus noticed Amara deep in conversation with several business owners, her legal pad already filled with notes and action items. She caught his eye and smiled. The strategic alliance building had begun. The town hall had not resolved all tensions. The path forward would be neither simple nor straight. But something had shifted in Oakwood Heights that evening, a collective recognition that community, like cuisine, could either rigidly cling to tradition until it became irrelevant, or thoughtfully evolve to incorporate new influences while honoring its foundations. As they prepared to leave, Marcus and Amara found themselves face-to-face with Karen near the exit. The moment was brief but significant, a nod of acknowledgement, not of friendship exactly, but of shared commitment to the difficult work of transformation. Outside, the neighborhood stretched before them, its tree-lined streets and diverse buildings illuminated by streetlights. The Bistro waited just a few blocks away, its sign a beacon in the evening darkness. Esther 1993, renewed 2025. A simple statement that now carried weight beyond its original meaning, a declaration of possibility not just for one restaurant, but for an entire community poised between its past and its future. The autumn evening light filtered through the Bistro's windows, casting a golden glow across tables adorned with small floral arrangements and handwritten menu cards. 6 months had passed since the confrontation that had thrust the restaurant into an unexpected spotlight, and in that time, the Bistro had evolved from a flashpoint of community tension into something more profound, a gathering place where Oakwood Heights past and future engaged in ongoing dialogue. In the kitchen, Marcus moved with focused energy, directing his team with quiet confidence as they prepared for the evening's special event. A taste of Oakwood, celebrating community through cuisine. Each dish on the tasting menu represented a different cultural influence that had shaped the neighborhood over decades, some acknowledged and celebrated, others historically marginalized, but now being brought into the light. Luis, how's the sofrito for the bacalao coming? Marcus asked, pausing at his sous chef's station. Perfect balance, chef, Luis replied, offering a small spoonful for tasting. My grandmother would approve. Marcus nodded appreciatively. She should. It's her recipe. The inclusion of Luis's Puerto Rican family dishes on the Bistro's menu had been an early signal of Marcus's vision, a restaurant that drew inspiration from its staff as well as its chef. In the dining room, Amara supervised the final arrangements, her legal pad replaced by a tablet where she checked off completed tasks with efficient precision. The bistro had settled into a comfortable rhythm under her management, her corporate law experience proving unexpectedly valuable in navigating the restaurant's newfound role as both business and community institution. The journalist from Food and Wine just called, she told Marcus as he emerged from the kitchen. She's running about 15 minutes late, and Eliza Washington has already arrived. She's at the bar reviewing her advance copy of the menu. Marcus glanced over at the noted Doe critic who raised her glass in acknowledgement. Her one-year retrospective article on how the Bistro incident had transformed Oakwood Heights was scheduled for publication the following week. The preview she'd shared with them had been measured but ultimately hopeful, chronicling not just their restaurant's journey, but the neighborhood's halting progress toward more meaningful inclusion. The front door opened, admitting James Chen and his mother, followed by several other local business owners who had become regular collaborators over the past months. The Taste of Oakwood dinner was their third collaborative event, each showcasing different aspects of the neighborhood's culinary heritage. Marcus, Amara, James greeted them warmly. The street is already buzzing. I think we might have started something important here. We're just providing the space, Marcus replied modestly. Everyone in this room is part of the transformation. The door opened again and Karen Whitfield entered. Unlike 6 months ago, her presence no longer created immediate tension, though a certain careful awareness still accompanied her interactions with Marcus and Amara. She had found a new role for herself, not at the bistro, where the breach of trust had been too significant for her return, but within the community she had called home for decades. Sorry I'm a bit early, she said, approaching Amara. I wanted to share the committee's latest updates before the other guests arrive. Amara nodded, gesturing to a quiet corner table. We have about 20 minutes. Tell me what's happening. Karen pulled a folder from her bag as they sat. The Business Inclusion Initiative has secured funding for 3 minority-owned business startups in the neighborhood. She couldn't quite keep the pride from her voice. The mentorship program is making a real difference. 14 established business owners paired with newcomers, sharing knowledge, connections, resources. Watching them from across the room, Marcus reflected on the complexity of transformation. Karen's journey had not been linear or perfect. There had been missteps, moments of defensiveness, occasions when her blind spots resurfaced. But her commitment had proven genuine. Her willingness to do the uncomfortable work of examining her biases consistent. The restaurant gradually filled with guests representing Oakwood Heights' full spectrum, longtime residents and newcomers, people of various races and backgrounds, united by their investment in the neighborhood's evolution. Officer Diane Rodriguez arrived with her partner, no longer in uniform but still carrying herself with the same measured authority. She caught Marcus's eye and smiled, a silent acknowledgement of how far they had come from that tense evening 6 months earlier. At precisely 7 o'clock, Marcus stepped to the center of the dining room. The conversations quieted as guests turned their attention to the chef whose restaurant had become, somewhat unexpectedly, a catalyst for community reflection. Welcome to A Taste of Oakwood, he began, his voice warm and inclusive. Tonight's dinner is a celebration of this neighborhood's culinary heritage, all of it, not just the parts that have traditionally been centered. He gestured around the room. Each course tells a story about Oakwood Heights, about the people who have contributed to its character, often without recognition. As servers began presenting the first course, Marcus explained its significance. We begin with Mrs. Chen's spring rolls, a dish that has been served at Golden Dragon for 30 years. When the Chen family first opened their restaurant, these spring rolls were dismissed by some as too authentic for the neighborhood. Now they're an Oakwood Heights institution. Mrs. Chen beamed from her table as guests savored her creation, the simple appetizer carrying the weight of 3 decades of persistence. Each subsequent course followed the same pattern, a dish with cultural significance, its story shared by Marcus or the community member who had contributed it. Luis's grandmother's bacalao, a traditional Bengali fish curry from the owner of the new market on Pine Street. Gerald Simmons' father's classic French onion soup, a nod to the bistro's origins. Between courses, Amara rose to make an announcement that she and Marcus had been planning for months. The bistro is proud to introduce our Culinary Pathways Mentorship program, she said, her lawyer's precision complemented by genuine passion. Starting next month, we'll welcome 4 aspiring chefs from underrepresented backgrounds for a 6-month paid apprenticeship. Each will learn every aspect of restaurant operations, from line cooking to business management. The announcement drew enthusiastic applause, especially from younger guests who recognize the significance of creating accessible entry points to an industry often gate-kept by expensive culinary schools and unpaid internships. As the main courses arrived, Marcus noticed Karen deep in conversation with a young black woman who had recently opened a bakery on Maple Street. There was nothing performative about their interaction, just 2 business owners discussing practical matters, the older sharing knowledge accumulated over decades, the younger offering fresh perspectives on community engagement. Quite a transformation, Eliza Washington commented quietly as Marcus passed her table. In the restaurant and beyond, Marcus nodded. Still ongoing, we have a lot more work to do. Of course, Eliza agreed, but there's value in acknowledging milestones along the way. The evening progressed with a natural rhythm, the carefully crafted dishes providing structure, while the conversations between them created meaning. By the time dessert was served, a collaboration between Marcus and the new bakery owner that fused French pastry techniques with Southern flavor profiles, a palpable sense of community had emerged in the room. Officer Rodriguez approached Marcus, as guests began to linger over coffee and digestives. I've been to a lot of community mediation sessions over the years, she said, but I've rarely seen one bear fruit like this. We got lucky, Marcus suggested. Rodriguez shook her head. This isn't luck. This is what happens when people commit to the difficult work of honest conversation and genuine accountability. She glanced toward Karen, who was now speaking with James Chen. Not everyone would have chosen this path. As the evening wound down, Amara joined Marcus near the bar, slipping her hand into his. We should do this more often, she said, not just for special occasions. Community dinners? He asked. Community building, she clarified. Using the bistro as a space for connection, not just consumption. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. I like that idea. After all, restaurant comes from the French word to restore. It's always been about more than just food. As they began saying goodnight to departing guests, Karen approached them, a mixture of emotions evident in her expression. 6 months had transformed their relationship in ways none of them could have predicted that first contentious night. Not friendship exactly, but a complex mutual respect forged through difficult honesty. Thank you for including me tonight, she said. The dinner was extraordinary. Your committee updates were encouraging, Amara replied. The funding for new businesses is a significant achievement. Karen nodded. It's a start. I'm learning that undoing patterns takes longer than creating them in the first place. She hesitated, then added, Emily has been asking about bringing her fiancé to the bistro when they visit next month. She says it's become the restaurant everyone talks about back in Chicago. We'd be happy to host them, Marcus said. Just let Amara know when they'll be in town. The exchange was brief but meaningful. Acknowledgement of how far they had come, recognition of the boundaries that remained, commitment to the path forward. As the last guests departed, Marcus and Amara stood in the doorway of the bistro, watching them disperse into the Oakwood Heights evening. The street looked much as it had 6 months earlier, the same buildings, the same trees, the same intersection of old and new businesses. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the visible surface, a change in how the community understood itself and its possibilities. Not exactly what we signed up for when we bought a restaurant, Amara observed, a hint of wry humor in her voice. Marcus smiled, his arm settling around her shoulders. No, it's more. They turned back into the bistro, their restaurant, their dream realized in unexpected ways. The sign above the door still read, Est 1993, renewed 2025, but those words now carried layers of meaning beyond their original intent. They spoke not just to the restaurant's history but to the community's journey, the painful reckonings, the honest conversations, the slow, imperfect work of creating belonging through contribution rather than exclusion. In the kitchen, the staff was already cleaning up, their easy banter filling the space with warmth. Luis called out a question about tomorrow's special. The new dishwasher, a young man from the neighborhood job training program, laughed at something Maria said. The rhythms of restaurant life continued, grounding the larger transformations in the practical realities of daily work. Marcus looked around at the space they had created, not just the physical restaurant with its renovated kitchen and carefully preserved dining room, but the less tangible space where tradition and innovation could coexist, where history was honored while new stories were welcomed. Ready for tomorrow? Amara asked, already mentally shifting to the next day's challenges. Always, Marcus replied, and he meant it in every sense. Ready for tomorrow's service. Ready for the ongoing work of community building. Ready for the next chapter of a story that had begun with conflict but evolved into something more hopeful. A narrative still being written, course by course, conversation by conversation, in the bistro and beyond. As they turned off the dining room lights, leaving only the soft glow of the kitchen visible from the street, the bistro settled into the quietness that restaurants hold between services, a pause filled with potential, a space of restoration, preparing once again to restore. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.